Hi, my name is Victor North, and in this video series, we will attempt to cover all of brewing history, going all the way back to before we were human, moving all the way forward to the present day. This is Brewing History. Episode 1, Biases and Beer Goggles. In our first episode together, we are going to begin by considering the big picture. I know what you're thinking. That picture is not so big. You just held it close to the camera. You can't fool me with foreshortening. But as I said, we are going to attempt to cover the entirety of the history of brewing, which is effectively the entire history of humanity. And while we haven't been around for very long at all in the grand scheme of things, on the human scale, that's an awful lot of time to cover. All of our time, in fact. And I think we need to start by zooming out and considering the big picture. To start with some big fundamental questions like, why? Why do we drink beer? Why do we consume ethanol? The negative side of beer and ethanol is quite well documented, and if you love beer like I do, then you probably have had intimate, first-hand experience with the potential downsides of drinking beer. Like me, you've probably had more than one occasion to ask yourself this question. Why? Why do we do this to ourselves? Why would any creature choose to regularly consume something with such obvious pitfalls and real dangers? How could that possibly get started, and why? We will discuss that question in more depth during our next episode, where we will consider how a random mutation millions of years ago led to a greatly enhanced capacity to metabolize ethanol, which provided our pre-human ancestors with a key adaptive advantage, the potential to harness a risky, niche food source, rotting fruit. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'd like us to ask another big why, which is, why study human history through the lens of beer? Is beer a useful lens with which to view history? Is it valid? If you studied history before, then you've probably looked at it through a very different lens. Again, if you're like me, then the very first stories and lessons that introduced you to human history were those of conflict, of war. Not just in the classroom, but at home. I knew from a very young age that my existence, my family's existence here in Canada, like so many others, was owed in no small part to the impact of World War II. It has been said that history flows forward on rivers of beer, but perhaps the more mainstream view is that history flows forward on rivers of blood. Certainly, many people begin studying history as a series of conflicts between groups of people and their powerful leaders, and without a doubt, both the causes and the consequences of these conflicts hold major impacts and lessons on world history, and are certainly worth studying. In fact, let's take a moment right now to look through the lens of conflict by considering the War of 1812. A remarkable and curious war which can offer us some important lessons to help prepare us for our journey ahead, as we leave the familiar framing of war behind and push off to travel through world history upon our river of beer. The War of 1812 is interesting and does hold salient lessons for us as we prepare to study human history through the lens of beer. But it is also a war that, for me, is close to home. Literally. My home is in the Niagara region, near the border between the United States and Canada, which is also home to several important sites for the War of 1812. One of the interesting things about this war is if you ask the question, who won the War of 1812? The answer you will get depends much upon whom you are asking. If you are joining me from America, you may hold the opinion that the young United States won their second war of independence. And to support this position, you might point to the fact that America didn't lose any territory in the aftermath of the war. Or perhaps you hold this position simply because it was what you were taught. I was taught that we won the war. And if you are a fellow Canadian, you might also hold the opinion that Canada won the War of 1812. And to support this position, you might point to the fact that America failed in its goal to gain any of our territory. And if they had won, would we not now be speaking with American accents and watching American television and listening to American music and well, we burned down the White House, didn't we? Didn't we? The White House indeed was set ablaze during the War of 1812, but we didn't start the fire. Canada didn't start the fire, being unavailable at the time, owing to not existing yet, at least not as a united or independent nation. Canadian Confederation happening only in 1867, and Canadian identity itself owing much to the impact of the War of 1812. As the National Post put it in an article from 2012 titled "Tallying the Winners and the Losers of the War of 1812, in short, we won because we repelled the invaders." The shared experience of standing up to the United States in terms of resources and manpower, a Goliath to British North America's David, united formerly separate British colonists and recent American immigrants. It forged the beginnings of a distinctly Canadian identity, even if it was negatively defined as not American. Canadian identity remains a slippery fish and is often still defined in opposition to the United States. In this way, the War of 1812 really helped to create our notion of Canada. A landmark Molson Canadian beer ad from the year 2000 leaned into this oppositional identity.
I have a prime minister, not a president. I speak English and French, not American, and I pronounce it about, not about. I can proudly sew my country's flag on my backpack. I believe in peacekeeping, not policing. Diversity, not assimilation, and that the beaver is a truly proud and noble animal. A toque is a hat, a Chesterfield is a coat, and it is pronounced Z, not Z. Canada is the second largest landmass, the first nation of hockey, and the best part of North America. My name is Joe, and I am Canadian.
Thank you.
And inspired a wave of beer-chugging patriotism as well as parodies before being quietly retired 5 years later when Molson merged with Coors. We still don't know what a Canadian is, but we do know that a Canadian is not an American. Probably. Usually? In this way, Canadian identity is similar to that of the identity of the craft brewer, where we still don't agree on what a craft brewer is, only that they are not a macro brewer. Damn it. Probably. Hopefully. But the goalposts keep shifting. When Sierra Nevada started, pellet hops were the domain of the macro brewer. But the culture and authenticity of brewing was felt to lie in traditional whole cone hops, so that's what Sierra Nevada built their brewery to use. We've largely moved on from this concern over pellet hops, and they are ubiquitous in the industry, at all breweries, at all scales. It would be strange indeed to enter a small local brewery and scoff, "Oh, you use pelletized hops? I thought you cared about the craft and art of brewing." When I started in the brewing industry, this argument over pellet hops was largely settled. The line was drawn and crossed over other things like brewing with commercial enzymes, or high-gravity brewing, or brewing under a certain volume of production. Rules we keep breaking and never fully came to an agreement on in the first place. With the end result that we suffer from no real shared definition of a craft brewer, or of a Canadian. Prior to the war, there were European colonists in America and European colonists further north in Canada. To the American colonists of British descent, they saw the Canadian colonists of British descent, somewhat fairly, as much more like themselves than like those in the faraway British Empire. And having just fought and won a war of independence from that empire, the biggest empire in history, the Americans now saw themselves as liberators of Canada, extending their hard-won freedom to their northern colonial cousins. And so, they expected to be greeted as such, and predicted that conquering the North would be, quote, a mere matter of marching. American General Alexander Smith reminded his troops before their invasion of Canada that they were not a boot to enter a foreign nation, but merely a part of America in waiting, populated not with foreign aliens, but with Americans who just didn't know it yet, saying that they, quote, will enter a country that is to become one of the United States. You will arrive among a people who are to become your fellow citizens. Many Americans saw this annexation of Canada as a natural conclusion or the inevitable outcome of the War of Independence. Or they felt like it was the unfinished business, the hanging unplayed coda of their battle for independence that they still desperately needed to hear. A feeling Congressman Richard Johnson summarized when he said, quote, I shall never die content until I see England's expulsion from North America and her territories incorporated into the United States. But to the people in the North, some of whom were still loyal to the Empire, or were recent Loyalist refugees from the American War of Independence, or who escaped slavery in America and came to Canada, where some enlisted as British soldiers to fight alongside Indigenous warriors and French-Canadian militiamen. To these people, the invading United States was no liberating force, and they offered them no hero's welcome, but a firm resistance. While the causes and outcomes of the War of 1812 are still debated, many historians will simply say that it ended in a draw. Call it a tie. Congratulations, everyone. You are all winners. Well, almost everyone. As the 2012 article quoted earlier put it, quote, while Canada, Britain, and America could all claim to have won the War of 1812 with justification, the people who were here first, North America's indigenous population, definitely lost. This is a mainstream opinion held by intelligent, respectable people.
So neither the U.S. nor Britain actually won, but the Indians, who suffered significant casualties and gave up even more territory, definitely lost.
When sorting out the winners and losers of the War of 1812, it seems clear that European and colonial forces can all make some claim to victory, or at least fought to a draw, but the indigenous populations were definitely the losers of the conflict. But this is an idea that is now being challenged by some historians, people of indigenous ancestry, and even the Government of Canada. Our government wrote from the Office of the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, quote, "In the opening battles of the war, First Nation warriors and Métis fighters were largely responsible for British victories." Like our other article, this was also published in 2012, a year when Canada was doing a lot of reflecting on the War of 1812, 2012 being the bicentennial of America's first ever declaration of war, and a year where I found myself brewing up a cask of 1812-inspired ale, an attempt at a recreation of colonial-era ale using wild-growing hops found in the Kingston area of Ontario. These hops were thought to have been planted by an Irish immigrant who labored on the construction of the nearby Rideau Canal, which was built as a direct consequence of the War of 1812. In any case, one such early victory handed to the British by their First Nation allies was the Battle of Queenston Heights, where here, on the site of the conflict, you can find now this memorial, completed in 2016, too late for the bicentennial, and known as the Landscape of Nations. It commemorates the first major battle of the War of 1812, during which General Brock was killed, and Indigenous forces turned the tide for their British allies, allowing the British to still seize victory that day. It is precisely because of victories like this that some will challenge the commonly held conclusion that the Indigenous forces definitely lost the War of 1812. This and the fact that the Indigenous forces saw themselves and acted as allies to the European forces, not as subordinate soldiers, but as independent allied forces. This fact could frustrate the generals and leaders of the British and colonial forces, who could not simply command the Indigenous warriors into battle like their regular soldiers. Indigenous leaders could simply refuse to fight if they felt that their warriors were unlikely to survive the conflict, generally preferring to hold an advantage in combat, and generally preferring to fight in a style that we might now call guerrilla warfare, or irregular combat. Irregular as opposed to the regular manner of war that the Europeans were then accustomed to. To the Europeans and the colonists, this irregular warfare of the Indian was both uncivilized and dishonorable. It did not respect the ruse de guerre, or the rules of war, which at the time favored doing things like lining up in orderly rows and marching together across an open field towards the cannon and musket fire of the opposing army. I can easily imagine why the prospect of marching in an orderly, civilized manner towards your death didn't thrill the Indian warriors, but it did upset many of the Europeans. Scottish philosopher Henry James wrote earlier in 1774 that Europeans possessed what he defined as active courage because they would fight exposed and out in the open, while North American savages possessed only passive courage, as they preferred stratagem and surprise. The British would largely stick to their civilized approach to war, if there can truly be such a thing, until World War I and the development of the machine gun, which helped to lay to rest any lingering notions of civility in war. Despite the general dim view that the Europeans held of the irregular war tactics of the native North Americans, it did not stop the Americans from adopting these tactics when it suited their purposes, such as in their earlier war of independence from the British. In a letter from 1775, a British regular wrote, quote, "Colonel Smith of the 10th Regiment ordered us to rush on them with our bayonets fixed, at which time the peasants fired on us, and our men returning the fire, the engagement began. They did not fight us like a regular army, only like savages, behind trees and stone walls, and out of the woods and houses. By the War of 1812, neither the British nor the Americans had come to approve of or regularly engage in irregular warfare, but the Americans definitely understood the effectiveness of the Indian mode of fighting, and they feared it. By the time war was declared by America in 1812, Tecumseh and his Confederacy had already been fighting a guerrilla war against the United States for some 2 decades, pushing back against the westward push of the American colonists. By the time he allies with Brock, Tecumseh led a large force of thousands of warriors, battle-hardened and assembled from many indigenous nations. Tecumseh was known, hated, and feared by the Americans. And Brock would capitalize not just on the martial strength of his indigenous allies, but on the strength of their reputation and on the fear that their uncivilized and effective combat tactics could strike into the hearts of the invading American forces. Using psychological warfare, he warned in a letter to American Major General William Hull, who would go on to surrender Detroit to Brock without a fight. Quote, "It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences." Here, in the Battle of Queenston Heights, some 300 Mohawk warriors, under the leadership of John Norton and John Brant, moved to the top of the heights in stealth and fell upon the American forces in a surprise attack. The indigenous forces were repelled without anyone being killed, but the Americans were badly shaken by the experience, both here and across the river, as the hundreds of war cries from the Mohawk forces echoed from the heights and were heard across the river. American militia on the other side, waiting for boats in Lewiston, New York, lost their nerve and now refused to board and cross over to join the fray. Fear had gripped them. As an American general later wrote, quote, "To my utter astonishment, I found that at the very moment when complete victory was in our hands, the ardor of the unengaged troops had entirely subsided. I rode in all directions, urged men by every consideration to pass over, but in vain. When the British launched a counterattack and the war cries of their Mohawk allies brought the Americans already on the Canadian side also to terror, they broke rank and took flight without an order to retreat. With boats no longer coming from New York, neither to bring reinforcements nor to evacuate the retreating men, the American generals foresaw a massacre and surrendered to the British, cursing their forces who would not cross the river to face the Indians, and dismayed at their forces who, only after surrender, came crawling out of hiding. They discovered, to their shock, that some 500 American men had chosen to hide during the battle and only emerged afterwards in order to surrender too. Looking at the impact of the indigenous forces in the Battle of Queenston Heights and in the surrender of Detroit, you can begin to understand the argument that the indigenous did not lose the War of 1812, but on the contrary, were of pivotal importance to Britain, rather preoccupied with Napoleon at the time, not losing the war badly. The very existence of Canada as an independent nation from America, owing much to the efforts of indigenous forces. So why do so many say that the indigenous lost the war? Returning to that article, the United States, meanwhile, could claim to have won the war because they didn't lose any territory in the Treaty of Ghent, says Wesley Turner, a retired associate professor of history at Brock University. But more importantly, the British ceased supporting First Nations people in their fight against American settlement in the Midwest. Although this goal was barely mentioned by U.S. President James Madison in his war message, Turner says it was central to U.S. ambitions and the reason why U.S. interior states supported the war. Up to 1812, the British had been arming natives, defending their lands against U.S. encroachment. Afterwards, the British dropped this support and deserted their allies. With the Treaty of Ghent in place, the United States could move into native lands without fear of British opposition, and they seized the opportunity. Quote, Native Americans that fought as British allies hoped that the support of a powerful European ally would allow them to roll back the American settlement frontier and secure their homelands and independence. Instead, they suffered a catastrophic defeat, and the consequences for the winners and losers continue to play out today, 200 years after the War of 1812 began. The catastrophic defeat of Native Americans mentioned earlier didn't really come on the battlefields of the War of 1812. It was at the negotiating table. So arguably, the Indigenous warriors didn't lose the War of 1812 so much as they lost the peace negotiations. Perhaps not surprisingly, as they weren't given a seat. When the peace talks opened, the central demand of the British was the creation of an Indigenous state. The British strategy for decades had been to sponsor the creation of such a state for Native Americans, which would achieve the goal of a buffer state for the British from the Americans, blocking further American expansion into British-held territories. The Americans outright rejected this demand and refused to consider any creation of an Indigenous state, but also refused to include Indigenous nations directly in the negotiations in any way. A negotiator for the British would later remark, quote, I had, till I came here, had no idea of the fixed determination which prevails in the breast of every American to extirpate the Indians and appropriate their territory. So the British dropped their demand, abandoned their Indigenous allies, and also agreed to return all the freed people that, during the war, Britain had liberated from slavery in the United States back to America. Thankfully, they also broke that promise, and instead, eventually, in 1826, Britain paid the U.S. government the equivalent of over $33 million today as compensation to the American slaveholders for their losses. Perhaps the Indigenous may not have lost in the War of 1812, but they most certainly did lose in the Treaty of Ghent. The War of 1812 demonstrates clearly that history is complicated and how basic questions concerning major world events like who won the war may not have a clear answer, and the answer given could depend much upon the perspective of the person answering the question. Who won the War of 1812? Who's asking? Let's keep 1812 in mind as we consider other, less recent or less impactful events in history. Clearly, human conflict is a hugely important part of history, and war is very impactful to the story of our shared past, but war is not the only lens through which to view history. It is a very popular lens, however, and conflict framed my understanding of all human history until I studied history again in university. Now through the lens of art, which I think is a wonderful, if thick lens through which to view world history, despite earning a D in my first term of Survey of Art History. I had an inspired teacher, but a notoriously difficult one, who began each semester by writing idiots on the chalkboard circling it, and then crossing it out. No idiots allowed. That was a challenging classroom rule, especially for a merry idiot like myself, especially then. In Dr. Michael Farrell's classroom, I learned that in order to understand art and the artists who had made it, I needed to understand much of the context. I needed to learn something of the culture and the time and the place in which the art was made and in which the artist lived. To understand art history, I had to understand new things about politics, power, and religion. I did my best, and in the next art history class, I earned a C. But I love both classes, and by the time I finished my next class on art history, Art Hist 339, Japanese art, I had earned an A, developed a love of history, and an appreciation for how the lens we choose to consider history with can dramatically change what it is that we see, even when looking at the same thing. When I began studying art history, we looked at it almost exclusively from the Western perspective, the Western canon of art. In Japanese art history, I had an opportunity to not just look at a culture and a tradition that was new to me, but also look with a new perspective on a culture which was familiar. I had an opportunity to consider the Japanese perspective on the Western tradition. When I began studying art history, we also looked to the great men of art, whether it was the legendary geniuses of the Renaissance or the rebellious visionaries of modernity. This individualistic approach was a standard framing for viewing art history. This is a long-held perspective for considering history of any kind, art or otherwise. We tend to look to the geniuses, the rebels, the villains and heroes, the main characters of ages past. I was first introduced to the great man theory of history in high school, which formalizes the notion that all of human history is carried forward on the backs and by the great deeds of a few key individuals. A notion expounded by Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, who wrote in the 1800s, quote, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." This great man perspective on history is problematic beyond the name itself, though the name is problematic too. Though Carlyle and others tend to be more literal in the interpretation of the words great and man, heroic males, both great and man are sometimes interpreted in a broader, somewhat archaic sense. Great, not meaning wonderful or excellent, but meaning something more like prominent, important, impactful, big. Here, great can mean something more like awesome in the antiquated sense, and man is also often used in a more outmoded sense here, meaning a person of any sex, a human. So, both Adolf Hitler and Joan of Arc could be considered great men under this approach, despite the fact that Joan was not a man and Hitler was not great, to say the least. But beyond the problematic language, perhaps the greater criticisms of this approach have less to do with the semantics of what we call it, and more to do with the notion that when considering history, the lives and impacts of everyday people are of much lesser importance than those of the heroes of the story. And perhaps everyday people are not worth consideration at all. Under this approach, if you want to understand World War II, you don't really need to consider the experiences of everyday people. You only need consider the experiences of the major leaders. You might also consider some of the notable generals, but not the experiences of the individual rank-and-file soldiers, nor that of the nurses, nor the civilians who in essentially every conflict suffer at least as many casualties as the combatants, and in some conflicts can make up the overwhelming majority of all deaths. The consequence of this worldview, the great man worldview, of looking with the great man lens on history, is that you can lose broad swaths of the story. You can lose sight of the big picture. And you will certainly lose great stories, as most things that have happened to people who aren't famous. Despite this, it wasn't until relatively recently that the history and the impact of everyday people was more deeply considered by many historians. Despite the downfalls of using a great man lens to view history, it remains a popular approach, and perhaps that really shouldn't surprise us, as it also remains a very popular lens through which to understand the present day. After all, it's the same biases and lenses that we use to interpret our present that we generally bring first to our views of the past. And today we still tend to study and primarily discuss the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks of the world, and to credit them personally with the successes or failures of the people and organizations that they lead. Why? Well, we generally are interested in people who make more noise, who are louder, bigger, greater. We like to talk about those who move fast and break things. Not only do these individuals make better, stickier stories than the quiet and unsung efforts of a group of engineers who contributed to developing something important over many long years, this individualistic lens helps us to simplify a complex story. How did it happen? The great man did it. Even if he was not actually involved, or even if their leadership was an active hindrance to the success of the team. If you have ever had a boss unfairly take too much credit or be given unearned credit for the efforts and successes of a team that you were on, then you will already understand the limitations of the great man theory from personal experience. Yes, CEOs, kings, dictators, presidents, and other leaders are important and worthy of historical study. But you will never get a full picture if you don't also try to consider the lives of everybody else too. It is more complex. It is harder to do, but it is worthwhile. As an example, the English brewster or alewife tradition of brewing emerges from a history of domestic brewing, a rural household skill which becomes a household industry, a cottage industry, one primarily led by women who were, at the time, generally lacking in social positioning, political clout, and access to educational opportunities. Rural women typically held some of the lowest rates of literacy and learned their brewing skills through hands-on training. The domestic brewing tradition was therefore largely an oral tradition, a family tradition, passed on from mothers to daughters and generally not passing into the written record. Where primary source writings on women's domestic brewing does survive, it tends not to be authored by the brewsters themselves. As Pamela Sambrook writes in Country House Brewing, 1500 to 1900, William Harrison, writing in 1577, took it for granted that although he might describe the manner of brewing for the purposes of his book, it was his wife and her maidservants who did the actual brewing. It was his wife who explained it all to him, perhaps at some unnecessary length, for, as he said, she hath oft informed me of the details, which he went on to relay to his readers. On account of this, it can be rather challenging in modernity to piece together what those older domestic brewing traditions really were. patriarchal notions of what type of work was valuable and whose works, whose labor were worthy of record meant that choices about what got recorded and who did the recording were affected by the attitudes of the day, and interpretations of these records remain affected by the attitudes of the present. So, we now have considerable debate over precisely what the realities of domestic brewing were and how much these traditions of female-led household brewing impacted things like our modern brewing practices and our modern myths and legends, particularly of witches and their witches' brew. We will explore this uncertain but important topic further when we discuss medieval brewing in Europe. It may prove a controversial discussion, but since we largely can't agree on the facts of what's happening today, on the causes and impacts of current events, perhaps it should not surprise us that we have trouble coming to a general consensus on the causes and impacts of events in the past. Again, we usually cast our gaze into the past, wearing the same lenses that we use to interpret the present. And we seem to be in something of a epistemic crisis at the moment. Not just disagreeing in worldview or values, but fundamentally disagreeing on what we know to have happened or know to be happening and how we can know this. Beyond a normal difference in perspective on events or disagreement on relative importance of events, we seem currently to be unable to construct even a shared understanding of what the events are, a mutual agreement on what is even happening. So with this in mind, I will do my best to introduce you to some key concepts and some important stories from the past, that vast swath of land, that foreign country, which is our shared human history. But inevitably, it is impossible for me to give you a completely full picture. But that's not all bad news. It is true that the lives and experiences of domestic female brewers weren't always considered important to the history of brewing, but our perspective on that is changing. And so, our history of brewing is changing too. The good news about our understanding of history being worse in the past is that it is better now and will likely be even better in the future. We tend to think of history as static. After all, it is history, done and over with. But history is, in fact, always changing. If I were recording this series just a decade ago, I would have recorded a different story. And I would have looked younger and less wearied by a decade of stress and unburdened with our collective trauma from the pandemic and all the events that have followed since. And if I were to re-record this a decade into the future, I'm sure it would be another story still. Hopefully, a better one. We tend to think of history as fixed, but it is really always changing. And this is a good thing. We are always learning more about the past, thankfully. And one great way to do that is to look at the same story from another perspective, through another lens. But why beer? Beer is, in my opinion, absolutely essential to understanding our history. Though I am certainly not the only person to hold that opinion, I am certainly a rather biased person. when it comes to appraising the value of beer. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking about beer, talking about beer, making beer, and drinking beer, I tend to navigate my entire world with beer goggles on, so to speak. And I tend to interpret everything through the lenses of beer. So let's consider some other approaches, some other lenses through which to view human history. Maybe history flows forward on rivers of money. Money makes the world go round, after all. You could certainly look at world history through the lens of money and finances, and a great example of this approach would be The Ascent of Money, a financial history of the world by Neil Ferguson, who, quote, reveals financial history as the essential backstory behind all history, arguing that the evolution of credit and debt was as important as any technological innovation in the rise of civilization. I would agree with that statement and with the author when he writes, when human beings first began to produce written records of their activities, they did so not to write history, poetry, or philosophy, but to do business. It's true. We developed our earliest writing systems not to capture the beauty of our world or to express the truths of our souls, but in order to do business. To record what is owned and count what is owed, and like a calculator flipped upside down with 58,008 punched into it, we only later bent this wonderful new tool of business towards the creation of art. What kind of business helped to drive the creation of this essential new human invention? What needed to be counted that helped to drive the creation of a kind of proto-writing, leading to the development of written language, as well as the evolution of credit and debt? On the following page lies our answer. Barley. It was the business of barley, beer, and brewing. Many of the earliest surviving tablets concern who was owed beer and barley, the debts of grain, beer, and bread. Not at all shocking for a civilization that was built on a foundation of beer and bread. More on this in a future episode. Maybe history flows forward on rivers of cotton. In this book, Empire of Cotton, A Global History, Sven Beckert, quote, makes clear how these forces ushered in the world of modern capitalism, including the vast wealth and disturbing inequalities that are with us today. Cotton, which I am wearing some of today, and you probably are too, unless you are watching videos on the internet in the nude, is similar to money in that, surrounded by its impacts and the material itself, it is easy to take for granted, to assume that our world of cotton is just the natural order of things. But there was a time in Europe where if you were wearing clothes and not watching morality plays in the nude, it was wool, flax, or leather that you were wearing, but it was not cotton. There was a time where Europeans who were used to wool but largely unfamiliar with cotton concluded that cotton fibers must be the fur of some kind of animal. And upon learning that it was plant fibers, invented a new kind of plant-animal hybrid, the vegetable lamb, to explain this apparent paradox. Cotton and money are not unrelated subjects, as all of our histories intertwine. And an immediate example of that would be this Canadian $2 bill that I saved from when I was a young boy, when the toonie, or our $2 coin, was introduced to replace it. To explain the name, our $1 coin came first, and features a Canadian loon on the non-royal side. So the new $2 coin was dubbed a toonie, despite featuring a polar bear and not two loons. Doubloons was also suggested, but toonie won out. Anyway, this old $2 bill is now worth about $10 today, and the material it is made from is cotton. Current Canadian dollar bills are made from polymer, a durable plastic, starting in 2011 with cotton fiber being phased out by 2013. Our new plastic banknotes have updated security features. Like older bills, they have secrets that only the fire of ultraviolet light can tell, but also now have secrets that only the fire of laser light can tell. According to the Bank of Canada, these plastic bills are also much longer lasting than the older cotton paper notes, which is easy to believe. Plastic is very durable and endures all over our world. Plastic can be found essentially everywhere on our Earth, from the highest peaks to our lowest points, and everywhere we go. In the clothing we wear, in the food we eat, and in our own bodies. We are now the plastic people. Like it or not, we are perhaps no longer the people of wool or cotton, or the people of wheat or corn or rice, but the people of plastic. We are in the age of plastic, and like the Carboniferous period before it, where the emergence of a new life form, scale trees, which created a novel new material, wood lignin, which at the time lacked any microorganisms that could effectively break it down and metabolize it. So when these prolific early scale trees died, they didn't really decompose, but rather accumulated, eventually becoming what we call coal. Like early wood, our novel plastic is so durable in large part because it doesn't rot. It's new. And nothing has figured out how to really eat it yet, though the microorganisms are coming. Life finds a way. Our plastic bills are still quite safe from moldering away in our wallets, for now. It is ironic that much of our plastics, synthetic plastics, are based on fossil fuels like coal. Indigestible materials from the Carboniferous dug up and converted into new indigestible materials to form its own new layer in the geological record. Surely any future anthropologist will notice when plastics appear, from early Bakelite telephones, which are derived from coal tar and methanol, and are to be found in midden pits, trash dumps, to the sedimentation layers embedded with microplastics found all over the world and also found implanted in our own human remains. I would imagine that future anthropologists looking at the Anthropocene will think that plastic is a worthwhile lens through which to view this period of history. We see that plastic, like wood and cotton before it, is another potential lens through which we can view our history. Moving away from these materials and money into a realm closer to beer, we could also look at other beverages. History perhaps flows forward on rivers of tea and coffee. In Uncommon Grounds, Mark Pendergrass gives us the history of coffee and how it transformed our world. We see early on page 11, that coffee is not unrelated to beer. Quote, by 1777, the hot beverage had become entirely too popular for Frederick the Great, who issued a manifesto in favor of Germany's more traditional drink. It is disgusting to notice the increase of the quantity of coffee used by my subjects, and the like amount of money that goes out of the country in consequence. My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were his ancestors. His Majesty would go on to forbid the roasting of coffee except by government officials and would employ government spies, nicknamed coffee smellers, to sniff out unlawful roasters. Beer was at threat of being supplanted by coffee in Germany, just as ale was under threat by tea in England. Tea, like coffee, can also be an effective lens through which to view history. And in A History of Tea, Laura C. Martin explains, quote, "By most accounts, the British imported 40,000 pounds of tea in 1699, and much of this popularity can be attributed to the availability of sugar. Tea, coffee, and chocolate are all inherently bitter, and the addition of sugar to these exotic imports made them much more palatable. The upper and middle classes who could afford it, I think she means afford, but she could be using the antiquated sense of the word, who could do it, use refined white sugar, while the lower classes drank less expensive, poor quality tea mixed with coarse brown sugar or molasses. A cup of high-quality sweet tea was an unusual treat for most people. In spite of the addition of sugar, tea gradually lost its appeal in France as wine, chocolate, and coffee gained ground. Its popularity continued to grow in England, however, and unlike the French, the English gradually began to adopt tea as the beverage of choice at social gatherings rather than alcohol. There are a couple of interesting ideas there, a big one being that tea, that quintessentially British drink, is of course not native to Britain, which kind of makes it even more quintessentially British, no? In any case, it is an imported product to the UK, which, aided by the availability of imported sugar, supplanted and overtook the domestic ales as the everyday beverage of choice. Other than the sweetness of sugar, what gave coffee and tea such an advantage over beer and ale in Germany and England? The drug. Invigorating and sobering caffeine, being much better suited to the factories of England and the intellectual atmosphere of the Enlightenment than intoxicating ethanol. Tea and coffee arrived in Europe at an ideal time to provide an energizing alternative to booze, and cheap sugar helped the new medicine go down. As Elizabeth Abbott puts it in Sugar, A Bittersweet History, despite the surge in desserts, hot and cold, and in sweetening food generally, the true revolution in sugar consumption came after Europeans were introduced to three bitter but stimulating foreigners, tea, coffee, and chocolate, and discover that sugar transformed them into heavenly brews. Europeans first encountered mostly green tea from China in the mid-17th century. At first, they drank it as the Chinese did, without sugar. Within decades, even before black tea had become popular, they began to add sugar, likely influenced by British sailors who introduced their countrymen to Indian-style sugared tea, which prompted legions of others to take up tea drinking. In 1662, Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, who brought her Portuguese tea-drinking habit to England, where she served tea at court instead of the alcohol that, quote, heated or stupefied their brains, morning, noon, and night. Like cotton, sugar is another lens through which we can view world history and has important lessons to offer us on slavery and war, and can help us to understand the shape of the world as it is today. Maybe history flows forward on rivers of sugar. Sugar certainly played a major role in shaping our modern world and our modern palates. Sugar was something that was fairly rare for most of human existence and is now found in cheap abundance, like salt, which could also form a very valid lens through which to view all of human history. As Mark Kurlansky so brilliantly relates, salt has shaped civilization from the beginning. Consider iodine deficiency, still thought to be a leading cause of preventable developmental and intellectual disabilities, brought to kneel by the addition of iodine to table salt. Adding iodine to our salt is a cheap and effective solution to this problem. It is difficult to overdose on salt, while simultaneously it is really easy and enjoyable to include a little bit of it in your diet on a daily basis. Pretty much everybody eats it, so salt makes a wonderful delivery mechanism for iodine and has proven very effective in preventing iodine deficiencies. Iodized salt is not embraced everywhere. However, it is quite controversial politically in places like China and India, and it is simply not done in other places like Japan, where iodine-rich seaweed plays a major part in the diet of most Japanese and prevents most deficiencies without any supplementation required. In the United States, where the introduction of iodized salt is generally credited as a major cause for an upward trend, seen in measurements of intelligence at the population level, it is becoming controversial. To be fair, general improvements in nutrition overall are also thought to have played a major role in this American trend, as well as the later elimination of leaded gasoline. And beyond that, general intelligence tests are admittedly problematic. Nevertheless, despite iodine's potential benefit there is growing suspicion of iodized salt. As Mark Kurlansky puts it on page 444, after thousands of years of struggle to make salt white and of even grain, affluent people will now pay more for salts that are odd shapes and colors. In the late 18th century, British Captain James Cook reported that the Hawaiians made excellent salt. However, he complained that on the island of Atui, today known as Kauai, the salt was brown and dirty. The cause of this was the tradition of mixing the salt with a local volcanic red clay, alea, which is a brick red from the high iron content. Cook did not seem to understand that this dirty salt was not intended to be table salt. The salt was made for ritual blessings and religious feasts. It was also used to preserve marlin, and as a medicine, especially for purification during periods of fasting. But today, this dirty salt, alea red salt, is widely available, sought after by fine chefs and would-be gourmets. Gray salts, black salts, salts with any visible impurities are sought out and marketed for their colors, even though the tint usually means the presence of dirt. Like the peasants in Szechuan, many consumers distrust modern factory salt. They would rather have a little mud than iodine, magnesium carbonate, calcium silicate, or other additives, some of which are merely imagined. The new Cheshire Salt Works, which does not add iodine, adds sodium hexacyanoferrate 2 as an anti-caking agent. There is no evidence that such chemicals are harmful, and in the case of iodine, a great deal of evidence that it is healthy. Now there is talk of adding fluoride to salt for its health benefits, but modern people have seen too many chemicals and are ready to go back to eating dirt. He's not wrong. Things change. Trends reverse. There is some evidence that we are now seeing that upward trend in measured intelligence reverse, and one suspect is increased pollution in the air we breathe. In any case, yes, I think that salt, like sugar, could be a great lens through which to consider human history. one more lens to consider. Dan Koppel's banana, the fate of the fruit that changed the world. Does history flow forward on rivers of bananas? Perhaps. Like the ancient grains we will consider in upcoming episodes, bananas were among the earliest food crops to ever be cultivated by humans as we took our first stumbling steps towards agriculture. And bananas remain a major food source for humans. They are the world's largest fruit crop, but perhaps even more incredibly, they make the list of top staple food crops, a list that is utterly dominated by cereals. They are the fourth largest product grown overall, after wheat, then rice, and corn. Like wheat, rice, and corn, bananas are also used to brew beer. Does history flow forward on rivers of bananas? I think so. And I would imagine that if you are joining us from certain parts of the world where the banana has been a major force, you would agree with me. Places like Guatemala, Honduras, or Colombia, where the horrific banana massacre took place in 1928. Gabriel Garcia Marquez depicted a fictional version of the massacre in his novel 100 Years of Solitude. There are clearly many lenses through which to view history. Are they valid? Are they useful? Or are they bananas? Again, the answer you get depends much upon whom you ask. If you ask me, do I think that beer is a valid lens through which to view world history? Of course! Absolutely! Yes! And while beer is my favorite, I think that all of the lenses that we have just considered are valid as well. While none of them, like any one history, is capable of giving us a full picture, all of these different sources, all of these different lenses can reveal a different side of our shared history. They can allow us to see our story with a different perspective, and so they can help to give us a fuller picture in a way that any one of them cannot. If you are joining us because you are a brewer and you have a lot of vested interest and potential benefit to be gained from studying the history of brewing, for you, like me, a rationale for studying history with our beer goggles on, so to speak, should be fairly easily found. But I do think it's a valid approach for anyone. I think studying a new subject is a wonderful human endeavor for any reason or just for its own sake. So if you are joining us simply because you wish to see where this might be going, thank you very much for coming on the journey. If you're here because you're already inclined, like me, to view the world through the lens of beer, thank you for joining us as well. But you probably didn't need as much convincing. You're liable to agree with me on the importance of beer as I am confirming your own bias. Here it is worthwhile to remember that we are all coming to this, regardless of our different backgrounds, with our own our own predispositions, preconceptions, predilections, and prejudices, our own biases. The War of 1812 and the question of who won and who lost that war provides a great example of how our perspective on history can depend much upon who we are, where we stand, and what biases we hold. The War of 1812 also provides a great example of how history is complex, controversial, and always changing. And the War of 1812 also reminds us of how it is worthwhile to expand our perspective beyond that of the great men of history. Isaac Brock is a significant figure with many institutions and landmarks named after him here on the Canadian side of the Niagara region, but considering only his perspective cannot possibly give us the full and complex story of the War of 1812. Nor can we get a full picture of the history of brewing if we only look at the great men of brewing, like Eberhard Anheuser and Adolphus Busch, or Adolf Coors and Joseph Schlitz, or here in Canada, our Johns, both Molson and Labatt, or even my own great-great-great-grandmother, Susanna Woodhouse Culverwell Oland. Together, in this series, we will consider the stories of the big beer barons, those founding patriarchs and matriarchs of great brewing dynasties, as well as the experience of anonymous alewives. And I can't wait to get started. But the fact that history is complex, controversial, and changing also means that it is a fact that I am going to lie to you. I will try my best not to, of course, but I now know that I did lie about brewing history in the past, despite my best efforts then, and I understand that I will lie again, despite my best efforts now. I don't know what I don't know, but I do know that we've given ourselves a lot of ground to cover together, and there is only so much time to do it. So there will be some things that I will discuss less. So perhaps there may be a lie of omission. And there will be some things where I lie to you simply because I have been lied to and I don't know it yet. So that's my caveat from the start. Please take everything with a grain of salt because, as they say, history, especially in this case, is written by the victor. And with that, I suppose I should finish by giving a short introduction to myself. My name is Victor North, and I have been teaching courses on beer and brewing at the college level for almost a decade. I'm a national level beer judge with the BJCP program and also hold certifications in wine and spirits. I began my career as a home brewer and entered the brewing industry in 2010 as an assistant brewer at a brew pub, where I rose to head brewer before leaving to launch my own contract brewery, Garden Brewers. I love beer, brewing, and the rich history of our deep human connection to beer and brewing, and I am very excited to share more of these stories with you. Starting with our next episode, where we will talk about humans, where we came from, what we are, and why that drove us to drink. We'll also look at why we're Earth's all-species champion at marathons and beer pong. Until then, cheers.